Good afternoon, and welcome to the AARP California Pride Month series, LGBTQ Elders Look Back with Pride. My name is Dr. Julie Bates, and I'm an Associate Director here at AARP California. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Mason Funk, who is the Executive Director of the Outward Archive. Outwards is the first national effort to capture the stories of LGBTQ+ pioneers and elders all over America. Mason brings with him to AARP a phenomenal panel of California-centric LGBTQ older adults. Now, this is an interactive forum, and if you have questions for our panelists today, please be sure to enter them into the chat, because we're going to do everything we can to answer your questions during the time that we have together. Now it is my pleasure to bring to you Mason Funk.
Thank you so much, Julie, for that introduction. And it's an enormous pleasure to be here. I've lost track actually of how many events we've done with AARP over the past year or two, but it's all thanks to Julie, who really took a liking to this project, which made me very happy, and wanted to bring us in to the organization in a number of ways to share the stories of incredible LGBTQ+ elders all across the United States. The Outwards Archive is our official name, and you can find us online at theoutwardsarchive.org, and you just have to remember to spell Outwards with 2 O's, as the sign over my shoulder indicates. We've been around for about 6 years. It all came about due to my realization one night when I should have been asleep, but I wasn't, that we have an incredible core cadre of LGBTQ+ elders who have been advancing our rights and our visibility for 50, 60 years. And they are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they won't be around forever. And I thought somebody just really has to undertake a project to try to record their stories while we still can. And that's how Outwards was born. Jameson, June, and Jewel, who along with Julie, we are affectionately calling the 4 J's. They were some of our earlier interviews, and each one brings an incredible wealth of experience, wisdom, passion, and knowledge about how to bring about change. That's really what it comes down to. Our movement has been incredibly successful in creating change, not only for our own selves, but for the world at large, I believe. And so knowing how to bring about change is really one of the most powerful things we have to contribute to the world. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each panelist one at a time, and then play a short video, about a 3-minute video, that'll give you a little bit of a profile of the person. We'll come back from the video, and I'll have a quick follow-up with each panelist, and we'll go through the panelists that way one at a time, and then we'll start to have a roundtable conversation. But from the get-go, I want to encourage the audience to think of your questions, pop them into the Q&A, and Julie will be moderating them. And there will come a time sooner than later when we'll ask the audience, or I'll ask Julie, do we have a question from the audience? So and Julie just posted, put your questions here. Without further ado, I would love to introduce our first panelist, June Lagmai. June was born in Yokohama, Japan, and grew up in historic Filipino town in Los Angeles. As a college student, June became involved with Dignity LA, the first gay and lesbian Catholic group. June later helped found Asian Pacific Lesbians and Gays, the first such organization in Los Angeles. In 2009, after a lengthy career in politics and civil service, June was appointed Los Angeles City Clerk, the first Asian American and first LGBTQ+ person ever to hold that post. Today, June is still busy serving on a number of California and local committees. Without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and click on June's video and share it with you all. And please have a look at this video and get to know June a little bit.
Among ourselves, Asians, we kind of tease each other and say, oh yeah, you know, you're being passive aggressive again, or oh yeah, that's such an Asian way to do it. I think if you open their eyes, but you don't have to do it in a screaming way. You have to do it in a way that really makes them turn the mirror in on themselves. I think that's the only way that change happens. And I think that's why the movement succeeded so well. Rita's family had a nephew-in-law, and we overheard him saying something really ugly like, oh yeah, he's a faggot, or something like that. And, you know, the ears prick up. There's a couple of ways I suppose I could have handled it. I could have chewed him out right on the floor. I could have not said anything and just folded in and just said, well, I'll find another time. How I handled it is I went up to him by himself quietly and I said, that thing that you said, do you really mean that Rita and I should not be coming over to the house anymore? I mean, just really politely. And he was flustered, and of course I didn't mean anything like that. I and my dear friend Paul Chen were one of the first co-chairs of Asian Pacific Lesbians and Gays. The people that I met in APLG were just the most loving, powerful, strong people that I ever met. You could do what you wanted. There was space for everybody. You could be Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Southeast Asian, Indian, male or female, transgender. If you wanted to be a separatist lesbian, you could. If you wanted to hang out with the guys, you could. If you wanted to wear jeans, you could. If you wanted to wear dress and makeup, you could. There were some members who were FOB, fresh off the boat, who hardly spoke any English. Some were so deeply closeted that it was painful for them to even be alive. How that oppression took effect and how we dealt with it, there were as many ways of dealing with it as there were types of people. It was just a wonderful experiment. By the time I had the opportunity to compete to be a general manager for the city, to become the city clerk of the city of Los Angeles, I always remembered, if I stay closeted, I disrespect my partner. And I doesn't matter what happens to me, but I must not do that. People at City Hall started to know, yeah, June has a partner, and her name is Rita Romero, and they've been together for X amount of years, and they have a home life, and they've got dogs, and it was such a wonderful opportunity to say somebody made it to this level of government, and it's no big deal, and it must be treated in a natural way and in a supportive way. Among ourselves, Asians, we kind of tease each other.
Now, what happened here? Am I back? Let me unmute come back on camera. All right, there we go. Still managing the technical details. June, thank you for coming on camera and thank you for being here today.
Hi, Mason. Thanks for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. And I'm sure our audience is also really thrilled to meet you. I have a question, a quick follow-up question, which is some of the qualities you described as perhaps being, without stereotyping, perhaps inherent to the Asian American community, qualities of respect and subtlety when it comes to diplomacy. Do you think those qualities navigating the world of Los Angeles city politics, which I'm sure is not for the faint-hearted, do you think those qualities helped you to reach that very important position that you did reach?
Wow. Okay. So I have to mentally go back to when I actually filled that position. I remember thinking to myself, I may not be the best city clerk that the city has ever seen, but nobody will be able to do it the way that I can do it. So I wanted the approach to be completely me. And if I was sometimes goofy, or if I was sometimes stern, or confrontative or working behind the scenes. I just allowed myself to exercise all those faces of myself, because I think we all have those faces. And I think the more that we humanize our positions in our leadership, if it's LGBTQ or faith-based or intersectional, ethnicity-based, age, transgender, whatever it is, I think if we bring all the faces of our personality to it, it's just a lot more fun, you know? And it makes it a joy to live the experience. And that's the best way I can answer that.
I love that expression, bringing all of our faces, our goofy face, our serious face, our angry face at times.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, June, so much. I invite you to go off camera for the time being, and I'm going to
Thank you.
transition to Jewel. Let me get back to my script here. So our next participant panelist is actually, I'm going to go a different direction and go to Jameson first. Jameson Green is our next panelist. Jameson is a writer and a transgender health activist. After transitioning himself from female to male in 1988, Jameson helped make significant changes in San Francisco and California laws and regulations to promote access to healthcare, leading to transgender inclusion in the Affordable Care Act. Author of the prize-winning book, Becoming a Visible Man, Jameson was also the first American trans person to be elected president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Jameson is currently at work on an anthology on the history of transgender medicine, new essays, and a novel. Please give me 1 sec to transition here. Myself, no pun intended, sharing my screen and playing you a short video introducing you to Jameson Green.
Marriage was always suspect. I mean, it had begun.
Yep, I did it. I played Jules instead of Jameson's. I think I'm still sharing, so let's try this one instead.
When I learned about this organization, the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was in the mid-90s. It was for people who are dealing with practices and policies that affect trans people's lives. I was blown away by the fear that the professionals had about trans people. The majority were very, very tense. They felt there was a lot of responsibility in deciding whether or not someone could have surgery. They were very nervous about the idea that they might be perceived as being influenced by their patients. There was just a lot of trepidation everywhere. And that attitude, those attitudes made the patients, made the clients, made the trans people very angry. And I thought, trans people need more support, and professionals need to be less fearful. One of the things I said very clearly was, if you psychologists who were all in the audience don't want to be perceived as gatekeepers, don't be gatekeepers. And literally people went, how can we do that? And I said, stop trying to put brakes on people and start trying to help them. Your role is not to distance yourself from your client and say, wait a minute, I'm going to judge you now. Your role is to say, how can I help you be more comfortable in your gender? Why is that? That we can't look at the issues that people are actually struggling with and not judge trans people for being different, for not looking right, for having a gender variance that doesn't feel quite within the bounds of comfort for the observer, let it go. Let it go. There is no reason for you to be frightened of me.
Thank you so much, Jameson, for your Outwards interview, and thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Mason.
I love sharing a little tidbit, which I actually interviewed Jameson for the very first time 20 years ago when I was producing a documentary for the Discovery Channel on transsexuals, as they were called in the day. And Jameson was a wonderful, wonderful explainer. The Discovery Channel actually tried to cancel the program, but after they commissioned it, because they realized it was a lot more complex than they had realized, Jameson was the one who, I think, through his interview, got them over the hump, so to speak. So it's great to be reunited again. Jameson, it may seem ludicrous to those of us in the audience to think that professional care providers would become so entrenched in their gatekeeper role that they would have a hard time stepping out of it and be more patient-centric. Yet you're describing that was a major process of evolution. I know you can't cover it all, but can you help us to understand what was at stake for the professional caregivers? What would you say they were most afraid of that they had to let go of?
In the early days, really, they were afraid of peer pressure from their professional peers who thought that trans people were nothing but crazy. And most of the providers who worked with trans people really were interested in our experience and fascinated by us and amazed by our resilience and our tenacity and our capacity. And basically there were rules about how you distance yourself from a patient, and patients should not be giving any input to providers about, other than within a private session, about their lives and about what they needed in terms of assistance, be that legal or medical or social. And there was just no two-way street. The only two-way street was privately in a doctor's office. And then that never went anywhere. So nobody was really getting the concerted help that we needed.
Amazing.
So people were really afraid of each other. And people didn't want to be gatekeepers. That's why they asked the question, why are we being perceived as gatekeepers? How can we stop being perceived as gatekeepers?
Comment from the audience. One person commented, it doesn't seem at all ludicrous to those of us who are trans and work with other trans people that there should be this gatekeeper role. This gatekeeping most certainly still happens, and Jameson Green / WPATH's work is still essential. So thank you for being here today, and we'll get back to you, James.
Thank you.
For now, I invite you to go off camera.
Yep.
And I'm going to try to share the right video at the right time. And this will be for Jewel Gomez, but let me say a couple words about Jewel first. So Jewel Gomez, who is Cabo Verdean, Wampanoag, and Iowa, a Cabo Verdean, Wampanoag, and Iowa poet, novelist, playwright, and cultural worker. Jewel's 8 books include 3 collections of poetry and the first Black lesbian vampire novel, The Gilda Stories. Jewel helped produce Say Brother, the first weekly Black television show in the United States. She's a former president of the San Francisco Public Library Commission and was on the founding boards of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, known as GLAAD, and the Estrella Lesbian Foundation. Jewel's new poetry collection, entitled Still Water, is due out this year. And without further ado, let me see if I can successfully share Jewel's video right here.
Marriage was always suspect. I mean, it had begun as an institution to oppress women and make them property and it had evolved very slowly, but not enough to me to justify it as an institution. Diane and I, we had a discussion about what marriage meant, and when people went to City Hall to get married, we talked about it and decided, maybe not. So when the NCLR and ACLU decided to do this case against the state of California, they called us and said, would you be litigants? We spent, 30 seconds and said, of course. Because putting aside what we felt about the institution, if people wanted to take part in that, if people wanted that right, why should they be blocked? So we agreed and spent 4 years on the campaign trail, doing all the interviews and things like that. And of course, everyone always asks, and when are you going to get married? So we decided to do it. And then at the ceremony, which we had at the public library, what I saw in that moment was, this is a way you build community. Because I could look around, see members of my family, Diane's family, close friends, and library staff. I also performed a ceremony in a Mexican restaurant for two friends of mine. And at one point, when we did the ceremony, the guys who were the busboys, they stopped, they put their hands behind their backs in a kind of formal stance. I don't know how well they understood English, but they knew what was happening, they could see what was happening, and they respected it. That's how you build community.
Now, I was getting messages that the audio on Jewel's video was low. I turned mine all the way up. Jewel, I invite you to come back on camera. Hello. Could people hear okay? Was it enough to be understandable?
It was pretty, it was fairly soft. I knew what I was saying, so.
Okay, well, I guess.
Some people are saying their audio was okay. But they'll have to come on to Outwards and listen to the video.
There we go. There we go. Well, thank you so much, Jewel, for being here today. And I'm seeing a few more comments about the audio, but let's move forward. It may be surprising to, I don't know, to some people in the audience that there was ever a debate within the LGBTQ plus community about marriage equality. But it's so, to me, it was very interesting to interview a lot of people who had serious reservations. Some of the ones that you described, it was the roots of marriage are not exactly someone that everyone would want to say yes to. How do you, in the years that have now gone past, would you say your own perceptions of the value of marriage to our community have changed or evolved? And the reservations you once held, are those still there?
Over the years, I'm still on both sides of the discussion. I absolutely feel that the ability to marry is a right granted to anyone in our culture, and so absolutely should be granted to queer folk. And there is something universal about marriage that I think that's one of the reasons it stirred up so much anger on the religious right, because it's such a kind of core element in the culture. So people can relate to it, your relatives, your friends who are not queer, really, many of them, their eyes opened when they realized, oh, you mean you can't? And so I think it created a whole bridge for non-queer people to look into queer life and feel like I can do something to be part of the liberation. On the other side of it is, I think too much focus on marriage as an institution can make some people feel comfortable. Okay, we got married, everything's fine now. When of course that's not true. And I don't think we can be too comfortable. You know, if you have a white picket fence and a ring, if they put a ring on it, don't think that's the end of it.
Yeah. And it can also send the message implicitly or explicitly to people who aren't married and who aren't partnered that they're sort of missing the party.
Yes. I think that emphasis on the traditional marriage has left some queer people feeling left out, because not everybody wants to be in a couple. Some people have other variations on how they want their relationships to work, and they should not feel like they're stuck on the outside of our community in any way.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for being here, Jewel. And I would love to invite June and Jameson to come back on camera. And we'll have the full panel together for the first time. Let the party begin. And my question is going to be, the conversation will be a little California centric, because I think California is a great lens through which to see the changes that our community has experienced that we've actually made. And also to say, well, if it's happening right now in Florida and Texas, could it happen in California? So we got a lot to cover. And I don't want to only focus on our state's grand and glorious history. I want us also to be realistic about the challenges our community is facing nationwide right now. But let me just ask you to begin with, let's reflect a little bit on California. This is the Golden State. And for many people, it's the place that they looked at from afar and said, I'm going to California as a queer person, because I'm going to be happier there. San Francisco, LA, were both serve those kind of magnetic roles. What do you each individually, I know it's a broad question, but what has been your experience of California as a particularly fertile place to advance our movement, to make ourselves visible, to claim our rightful place within the American community? And anybody can jump in.
Well, I grew up in Oakland. I was born and raised in Oakland, and I love, love, love the East Bay. And I loved looking across the bay at San Francisco all the time. I loved the water. But I always felt, even as a child, that this was a space where people can breathe and people's eccentricities are not maligned. People's creativity is encouraged. That's how I felt growing up. And yeah, there were people around who were mean, and there were bullies, and there were people who were, homophobic or certainly transphobic. But on the whole, the environment felt welcoming no matter what. That's my personal experience.
I think I remember my interview when I took that position for the city, and I said, I truly feel like I'm a daughter of Los Angeles, because I grew up in not a rich area. Filipino town was, considered kind of a barrio area. But what was great about Los Angeles, Southern California, and California in general is the ease with which you could reach out to, if you needed supplies from Little Tokyo, they were there. If you needed to go to get your taco fix on in Elvira Street, it was there. And I think especially LA led the way before a lot of the major cities experienced their immigration of other cultures, other faiths, other ethnic experiences. Just the ability to access them made me very flexible, quick on your feet. You can jump from, phrasing yourself in Spanish or in Japanese. It was fun, and you had to be light-footed, but you could travel many paths. That's my view.
June, I presume you probably know that they recently put up a beautiful archway that leads from downtown LA into Filipino Town, right on 2nd Street, coming up the hill. And
Wonderful.
it says, welcome to Filipino Town. That
It's real now.
It's real, and it's also trendy for that matter.
Very good.
That's probably part of the story, but it's really fun because I think there is a growing awareness of Filipino cuisine, Filipino culture, and so your original home communities is coming of age and getting more visibility, which I appreciate very much.
Very good.
Jewel, you're the one person here who came to California from elsewhere.
Yes, and I feel like I was always acutely aware of the difficulties that people of color, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Mexican Americans faced in California. And it was very different from the East Coast. I'm from Boston originally, and I lived in New York for a very long time. But there was something about the historical oppression of people of color in California that has its own energy and shape. That said, part of the reason I think California is so appealing, there's two things. One is queer people are, like June, were laced throughout the culture. In my first year here, Mark Leno, who was on the board of supervisors, who was an out gay man, called me up, because that was the back in the day when you still could look somebody up on information and get their phone number, called me up and said, hey, I'm doing this kind of fundraiser. It's kind of a disco. It's for Halloween. Don't you want to come and co-host? And I thought, somebody from the board of supervisors is on my phone and he's gay. And I thought, this is one of the reasons that one comes to California. It's both scary because he could have been taking his life in his hands, but he was out and he was there. And that really, really, to me, embodied a lot about California. The other part of it is something that Jameson said, which is that California kind of embraces the queerness of everybody, not just queer people. Eccentricities are interesting to a lot of people. That's why you have the Beta Breakers, and one of my favorite pictures from the Beta Breakers is these two women dressed as giant vaginas on the race, and people waving and loving it. And I took a super shuttle, remember those, into the city from the airport, and the fellow dressed up who was driving the super shuttle was totally dressed up in drag. And I thought, yes, this is the place where I want to live. And I think those two elements make California very special.
Jameson or June, any further thoughts on that theme before I kind of go to maybe another question as a follow-up? Well, so then I wondered, California, I always lose track. If we became independent, what would be the 6th largest, the 7th largest economy in the world? Still kind of boggles the mind. But we've also been an incredible political experimentation, a place for experimentation. It's a place for creating, new laws, new regulations that then we ultimately had the opportunity to export. And I wondered whether it's at the level of legislation or practices, if anything comes to mind for you all in terms of how California has played a role nationally in kind of advancing the rights and visibility of the queer community.
I would venture to say that because historically, my area of town, which is LA, started out as a movie venue. It was a place of creativity and experimentation. So unlike other cities, say on the East Coast, which were more scholarly and rooted in a conservative way of conducting themselves. You know, the film industry taught people to think a little differently, and I think that kind of bled over the great weather here, the ability to go from the beach to the mountains within a couple hours, that the wonderful sunshine, I think, produced people that were willing to put forth ideas, and in a more creative way. So I really think it's because of the basis of how California came to be populated to start with.
I think it's interesting. You can't underestimate the way people are affected by weather. You know,
Yeah.
This is really different. It's really different out here because in general, it's much more mild. So people spend more time outside and connecting with each other physically. I think that's very interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that came to my mind, it's a combination. There's several lesbian activists who are disabled, who were very, very active in creating organizations that addressed Americans with disabilities and were very, very part of the core of the people who developed the American with Disabilities Act. And California was certainly at the heart, at the beginning of Americans with Disabilities Act. And many organizations out here were really started and supported by lesbians with disabilities.
Jewel,
Like the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley.
I'm just finishing reading the autobiography of Judy Heumann, Heumann, who was there at the longest sit-in of disabled people at San Francisco City Hall in 1977, spring of 77, that really launched the American disability rights movement. And Jewel, Outwards as an organization has been focusing a lot more attention on interviewing queer disabled individuals. And so I would love for you to share some of the names of these women that you're talking about, because we would love to.
Will do.
Awesome. Jameson, I think you also have something to say about this.
Yes, San Francisco's domestic partner legislation, which was like a regulation that was put in place in the 1980s, moved domestic partnership across the country and made it something that all companies would have to offer, all states would have to recognize. I mean, it was just a major shift. And so it was a stepping stone toward marriage, but it wasn't marriage. And people still live in domestic partnerships, and you don't have to be queer to do it. And right. I think that's one of the primary things that I think the queer community in San Francisco was able to accomplish, not just for queer people, but for everyone. Another way to look at relationships, and also the tax structure and all that stuff and benefits. And, not to mention trans safety and, non-discrimination legislation. San Francisco passed the first ordinance that included protections for non-discrimination, protections against discrimination for gender identity and expression. That applies not just to trans people, but to anyone, which includes many queer people. So,
may I ask a question of Jameson? Jameson,
yeah.
Expound a little bit about your perception of the Bay Area. Why was San Francisco? What was it that made it so instrumental in advancing and initiating all these firsts? I mean, if you think of San Francisco, you want to go back to, the hippie days in Haight-Ashbury, but you go back before that to the the influence of Chinese immigrants. What is it about San Francisco that moves it and generates such energy?
I honestly think part of it is that it's so compressed. It's surrounded on three sides by water.
Yeah.
In many ways, that's sort of like Manhattan, you know, that kind of energy that happens in Manhattan and creativity that happens there happens in San Francisco. I think being surrounded by water, being compressed, being put in with a lot of people who are different, and trying to negotiate all of those differences and all of those, you can't just move 300 miles away. Well, you could, but people don't want to. They want to stay there because it's beautiful. They want to stay there because they love the energy. They want to stay there because they want to be in their community, and they like that borderland and that crossing over to get that other kind of food in the next neighborhood. It's just creative.
Do you think that San Francisco Bay Area would have been the same had it not been for the Haight-Ashbury experiment? If Haight-Ashbury had never happened, do you think San Francisco would end up being what it is today?
Well, I think Haight-Ashbury happened because, well, I was part of I was involved in the music scene at that time. And I think the music was part of what brought that to San Francisco. And basically, it was just an environment where so many people could gather and be creative together and create this new kind of music and this new sound. And that just exploded out into the world. Los Angeles certainly has its own centers in that way. I mean, look at the Beach Boys and all that kind of music too, that comes out of Southern California, but it's, slightly around the same time. There's just this concentrations, I think, is what helps those things happen.
Thank you.
I also think going back just a little bit further, I agree with you. And I think the supporting that was the fact that these are port cities.
Yes. Again, the water and the weather too.
And the military. Interestingly enough, people getting out of the military after World War II and after that, pouring into these cities.
Yes.
From after having done military service, and they're free, and you could get a tattoo or find a boyfriend,
Yeah, and they just didn't want to go home anymore.
And I think was true somewhat of New York, but definitely true of LA and the Bay Area.
And even up in Seattle too. I think the whole West Coast.
Yeah.
In that respect.
Yeah. And I'm sure there is some queer historian who's got a book on that evolution. But it's really interesting to see what gay people were doing post World War II, post Korean War on our side of the country.
Mm-hmm. One of our audience member has contributed that queer history resources sometimes suggest it was an outcome of post-World War II settlement patterns by gay veterans, especially sailors returning from war, who had found each other during the war years and did not want to return to their rural or oftentimes more rural hometowns or just wherever they were from. Yes. It wasn't as enticing as I think San Francisco in particular.
Very good.
But there were certainly queer people there before World War II also. I mean, there's a lot of history of people coming after the Civil War, coming west, just the West in general, and ending up in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Well, it's that, I'm a child of the West. The West, it's had that kind of magnetic pull. Our nation just happened to have been settled initially on its eastern flank. If the United States, if this continent had originally been colonized on the West, maybe people would have been drawn to the East, but it was the East Coast that got the first colonizers. And so the West, I think, kind of held that allure of you can go there and you can find the great wide open spaces and so forth. I'm going to have to kind of direct this conversation. I can't believe that the time is moving as quick as it is. But this is, I guess, the result of a good conversation. Julie, I'm going to put you on alert because, I mean, really, I'm actually going to go to Julie right now. We've had so many interesting comments popping into the chat window that I want to leave some time for Julie to maybe bring 1 or 2 questions to the group.
We have gotten some amazing questions thanks to your stories. And I've gotten some PM messages, and I'm watching the chat as well. So the first question I'm going to ask you is one about being out at work. Was there a time in your life when you were not out at work, that you were in the closet about who you were? And if so, what was that like for you? And what finally gave you the courage to come out of the closet? Who would like to start? Julie, you're laughing, so I'm going to start with you.
I have a funny story because must have been 1980, maybe 79, and I had worked theater jobs before that. So people were always out in the theater. So, but I got this job at Hunter College in the dean's office in New York, and I was totally not out. And one of my supervisor was an extremely nice Jewish woman, like conservative Jewish woman. She brought me a dress back from Israel, And so this journal anthology I was in, it was called Lesbian Fiction, and it was where I first time published a Gilda story. And so my copy, I picked it up in the mail just as I was going to work. I had it on my desk. I was so excited. It was my first big publication. And Edith walked by my desk, and there it was sitting, Lesbian Fiction, and the contributors' names were plastered across the cover. And she looked down and she said, "Oh my, may I look at that when you get a chance?" And it was perfect. I mean, she could have gone screaming. She could have done any number of things, but I was lucky, just like with my family. She just said, "Oh, can I look at that?" So I have been very fortunate. That was my first big job coming out. And I was lucky. I was very lucky. She was more interested than terrified.
My experience has been, I have been fortunate because I have always been half of a couple. My history is that I met my partner when we were both 13 and high school, and we bonded immediately therefrom. So when I proceeded on to work, I never hid her because it felt like it would be disrespectful of her. Why would I be ashamed of her? And because I was lucky enough to live in a time where coming out was being celebrated and being pushed. But I do remember testifying before the city council at the time that domestic partnership was being considered. So we're talking about early mid 80s. And I was not in a high level position. I was actually in a mid management position at City Hall. And my supervisors and my bosses were saying, "June, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? Do you want to go before the council and identify yourself like that?" They were really scared. They were scared for me. But luckily, I never felt that because Rita gave me courage. I never had to navigate the world as a single person. And let me say, as an aside, earlier this month, Rita and I were invited to our 50th high school reunion, and we weren't going to go because, reunions, why should we go? And I don't want to go. And the organizer called me, and she pushed, and she goes, "June, I have read about you. I have seen your interviews. I admire what you're doing, and I want to tell you that I have a gay daughter, and I want to thank you because it was because of what you did that my beautiful daughter, who I love, was able to come out and be who she is." So what I have to say is I give more power to people that didn't have a partner that took that courage to work. So more power to them. But for me, it wasn't that difficult.
Thank you, June.
Well,
You aren't unmuted. I'm sorry. I thought you were muted.
No, just quiet. I never really made a big issue about my sexuality at work. Prior to my transition, I could not look like a woman if you paid me $1 million. I think people always knew that I was one of those. I didn't ever hide my partners. I did in the 1980s tell my employer that my partner and I were planning to have a child, and I wanted to be able to provide insurance coverage for her. So I wanted them to have domestic partner benefits, and they wouldn't do it. So they told me I was ahead of my time. So, but what they did do, which I told them was not what I wanted, was they raised my salary so I could buy an insurance policy that would cover her. That was a good thing ultimately, because I was actually being underpaid anyway. So, and it enabled me then in my next position when I moved to a different company a few years later. It gave me a little more leverage coming in to have a higher salary, because by then we were trying to have a second child. So, and we were on the leading edge of the lesbian baby boom in the early 1980s. But anyway, I transitioned in the late 80s, and I had to come out then because I was going to start using the men's room, and I wanted people to use masculine pronouns and for me. And so I just said, look, I went to every people one by one that I worked closely with and said, I have something personal I need to discuss with you. I'm a candidate for surgical sex reassignment. That was a term at the time. And, that means I'm going to start using the men's room, and I would like you to use masculine pronouns. And they all went, oh, okay. And then one guy said, are you going to get any more self-confident?
Thank you all for sharing that. And the question that I have now is now come in several different ways from in the chat and in PMs for me. And as you are all aware, as I am aware, there is a increasing rise of outright violence. I don't want to go so far as to say hate. It has to be hatred. There's the rise of legislation and local ordinances and all this stuff against LGBTQ people. And so the question I'm trying to form from all of these is, what guidance, what would you say to us and to allies that we can do? What can we do to combat this rise in anti-LGBTQ rhetoric? What tangible things, what advice would you give us in regards to this? June, I'll start with you because you came from elections, if I understand your role correctly.
Okay. I think here in Southern California and California in general, the reason why we've come as far as we have is because everyone came out. You got to come out. Along with all the regular battle protocols and procedures, fighting it at a legislative level, at the ballot box, in the media, but on a personal level, in your church, in your coffee club, in your book club. If gay people have to overwhelmingly come out. But what I am heartened by is a statistic that I think CNN released where they were talking about the rise in LGBT out people, starting with, post-war and then baby boomers and then millennials and so forth, that today 20% of the population identifies as fluid or as LGBTQ. That's 1 out of 5 people. That's a lot. And so being closeted is the way that our movement commits suicide. Everybody's got to come out, because in sheer numbers, that does not mean we let up on all the other things that we're doing, but that's the first and primal thing that we need to do.
Thank you, June.
You're
Joelle,
muted.
you're on mute. While Jewel unmutes, I'll just share with everyone, you may not be aware, that AARP is one of, if not the largest LGBTQ membership organization. We have more than 1 million LGBTQ members.
Really?
We do.
Wow.
And
I'm so glad I'm a member.
I'm one too.
Me too. Thank you. Jewel, go ahead.
I feel like the pendulum always swings back and forth. And unfortunately, one of the fallout from the excitement of having a viable female candidate for president and an actual man of color become president have been to energize those who didn't feel comfortable with that. And then the next president using that base and literally stirring it up so the tide changed to people trying to pretend they weren't hateful to encouraging them to be hateful.
Yes.
And
yes.
the way I think we have to work against that is to be continually active. We have to do things we wouldn't necessarily think of as radical, and that is activate whatever social group you are involved with to pay attention to local elections, to pay attention to school board elections, so that those local people who would legislate against us don't get into office. I mean, we did so during the last big national election, we did so much calling and postcarding for Georgia. I was starting to get a Southern accent from talking to the people in Georgia, trying to convince them to vote for the Democratic candidates. But we have to do that. We have to see ourselves as queer people as in the vanguard, because there's a lot of queer people who are conservative and who don't really care. But we who think of ourselves as progressive have to step into that arena and have a responsible, positive effort against the backlash that we're experiencing.
Right on. I like it.
Yeah, I go along with that, and I think that we need to stand up against the hatred and oppression, and show how immoral that actually is, and how unlawful it actually is. We have to stand our ground, and we have to push back and demand accountability for that kind of oppression.
Well, and on that very powerful message, I cannot believe it is 2:59 that we have come to the end of our hour together. And that's testimony to Jewel and June and Jameson and Mason's extraordinary work in bringing their stories to our members here in California and across the country. I want to thank you all for being here. It truly is always such a pleasure to learn from you and to hear from you. And I'm thankful for our members for joining us as well. And if you haven't already, next Wednesday will be the final of our AARP California Pride Month series, and we would welcome you to attend there as well. But Mason, Jewel, June, and Jameson, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Thank you,
I hope everyone
Julie.
has a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Good to see
Pleasure.
everyone.
Yes.
See
Yay!
you soon, and thanks
See you
again. Bye for
soon.
now.